Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Thursday morning webinar. I'm Chloe Tetra. I'm the health coach here with Ready Care. For this morning, we're going to be looking at the spooky world of fear and phobias, particularly phobias, trying to look at the difference between fear, anxiety, and phobias. Common phobias people can experience, what's happening under the hood with people when they experience phobias, how they come about, what's happening in the system, and how might they experience it physically, emotionally, and psychologically. We look at a very effective means of combating phobias, which is gradual exposure. And we'll finish off with giving individuals a list of particular options that may be helpful when looking at, if they've identified particular fears and phobias that they'd like to work on, things that they can do at home, and options that are out there, resources for getting a little bit of support if it seems a little bit daunting. So beginning, what is the difference between a fear and a phobia? They're fairly similar insofar as they will all fear, phobia, and anxiety. They'll all involve the fear center of the brain, but there are a few particular differences that are worth noting. So let's have a quick look on differences that would point that something is a genuine phobia as opposed to just your run-of-the-mill fear. So fear is one of our primal human emotions. It's brilliant to keep us surviving. It's there as an ally to us to assist us of dangers, and it prepares our bodies if we sense, within the kind of global holistic subconscious, conscious, if we have a sense that there's a threat and there's danger around, what fear does is it starts the mechanism, pulls the lever, and gets us in fight flight mode. It'll release particular things like cortisol in our body to help us to run faster if we need to fight better if we need to. So really, it's an ally. It's got a bit of a bad rap, I suppose, in our kind of 21st century lives where, overall, we don't have that many, thankfully, dangers lurking around at each and every corner. We're still hardwired to perceive those, to look for threats. When fear becomes persistent, irrational, and overwhelming, it's sometimes an indicator that there's phobias at play. So phobias would be defined as intense, irrational fears of specific situations, activities, or objects that pose little to no actual danger to us. So it's if we think, oh, I have a particular fear of me walking out into the street and there's a lot of reckless drivers this morning and being bumped into by one of them. That's something that wouldn't be as irrational because there's a precedence for it. Whereas, saying something, I'm going to say one of my own phobias because just to get it out there, I might drop dead if somebody hears me play an instrument. That's probably a little bit irrational. So that poses no actual physical danger to me, but my body senses it, and the signals that it gives me is, holy God, something terrible is going to happen. We're just going to blow up. We're going to just blow up. Our brain's going to shut down and we just will cease to exist. So let's not do that. So phobias can really, really disrupt daily lives and functioning of within our quality of life. So within, let's say, the world at large, there's about 12.5% of adults experience a specific phobia at some point in their lives. And these can range widely from fear of heights to fear of open or crowded spaces. And we'll actually give a little minute to see in a while what some of the most, some of the popular phobias, choose one now, but some of the most common ones that individuals can experience. So let's have a quick check with regards what would differentiate it from the likes of anxiety. They're common emotional response to perceived threat, but where phobias and fear would differ is a phobia is irrational. Fear is just a system. It's a system that alerts us to dangers. Phobias is when it becomes a larger response than the environment and the context would warrant it to be. And the difference with anxiety, which I think sometimes they can be kind of mixed up a little bit, is anxiety will be a kind of lower intensity fear response to nothing in particular. So that's where they split very much in the definition. Phobia, you know what it's about. So there's a particular, whether it be a dog for some people, whether it be a stage fright for me, I'm very conscious of what brings up the fear, and it brings it up so much that it has a very physical, psychological, emotional response, and it's very overwhelming. So anxiety can be overwhelming in some aspects, and this is where the thread of definition needs to be kind of clarified a little bit. Anxiety typically, though, will be a lot more abstract and a lot more nuanced. There's just a low sense of dread, a low sense of something's not quite right. Something is making me feel ill at ease. Something's making me feel like I'm not particularly safe. So the difference there being the level of ambiguity with anxiety tends to be its kind of defining marker, whereas with phobias, there's a very particular context that's eliciting a reaction. Anxiety can be a low grade, not ever quite feeling, good and perfect and all on and without that sense of fear. But unless one reaches the point where there's something like a panic attack, then for individuals with anxiety, it tends to be less of a spike response to a scenario. So I hope that clarifies them somewhat, because I do understand that sometimes they can be mixed up with each other, and all of them are reactions that are elicited by the fear center. So the fear that accompanies both phobias and anxiety are very real. It's not that one is more real than the other in any way, shape, or form. It just means that the environment in which they come about is slightly different. So the management of them becomes slightly different, which is why it's important to be able to differentiate, because if you want to actively look after them and mind yourself in that fear response, it's good to know as something a low-grade anxiety that's kind of been there from the time you wake up in the morning throughout the day. And we'll look at anxiety in greater detail in the coming weeks, because I do understand it's a problem that affects an awful lot of people out there, and especially more so with the rise of social media. But for today, it's mostly understanding the very, very sharp spike response that comes with phobias. So common phobias would include things like arachnophobia. That's the one that, most people would name, to be honest, if they're playing a quiz and told name a phobia. Arachnophobia, of course, is the fear of spiders. It's one of the most prevalent animal-related phobias. Acrophobia, it's one actually that I would suffer from as well. I'm a big phobic monster. Is the fear of heights. It's an irrational response to the fear of heights. And what I'd say there is it's normal to have a level of fear of, oops, if I fall, I'm a goner. Normal to have some amount of fear there. Where it becomes a little bit different is remember that piece that we talked about where you perceive an actual threat where there is no threat. I'll tell you a little anecdote about that, where early days, middle lockdown era, when people were allowed to go outside and go for walks, a few of my friends got really big into hiking, and I said, cheapers, I'll go along for one of the hikes, and went to Coomera Mountains, and gorgeous. On the way up I was going, cheapers, I'm terribly unfit, but this is great, getting the air. And as soon as it came to going back down, after we'd had a little snack on top, little chats, pictures, aren't we brilliant? I realized that I have absolutely horrendous acrophobia. I was petrified to put one foot in front of the other. I had children, pass me by, easy enough. It's for those of you that have done it, it's an easy enough walk, but for whatever reason, I was like a deer in the headlights. One foot in front of the other was like, Never realized it was that bad. Of course, it probably took about 3 hours to get me down the hill. I'd say they were going to leave me there at one point. But that would be a fear response that doesn't particularly match the context that it's coming out in. So if you found yourself avoiding windows, that, oh, I don't want to look out there because it's making me feel like I might fall, even though the window is closed, you're incredibly safe. That could point to potentially there being a phobia around that. Things like claustrophobia. It's a massive, massive one as well. The fear of being in enclosed spaces, elevators being a big one, where people will know, logically they'll know, well, people are going up and down the building all day long and they don't seem to be suffocating. So I don't understand logically why I think that. But the thought that in an enclosed space, they'll get massive anxiety and a thought or feeling, an irrational fear that they might suffocate or that they just can't stay in there. So that would be a very big one. Now, social phobia, again, there's a bit of an interplay here with things like social anxiety. It just, again, depends on the level of fear response that it elicits. It's fear of social situations, which can lead to avoidant or social interactions of events. And I think that's one of the kind of reflective aspects as you're listening to this, is to check if there is a known fear that you have, an irrational level of response that you have to a particular scenario that might not be as cut and dry as a spider, a snake, claustrophobia. That is there something in there that actually elicits quite a strong response to you? That maybe is more nuanced. Maybe it's through like a relationship. Do you have a massive fear of conflict? Do you have a phobia of conflict? Are you finding yourself in particular patterns that keep you away from situations where you would like to bring more of yourself because you're absolutely terrified of what would happen if somebody disagreed with me? Or what would happen if somebody found out I wasn't really as good at something than I said I was, or lots of these types of scenarios. And I think oftentimes phobias can be placed with an object. There's an object, or I'm going to be a bit mean to animals here and say there's an object of a snake. There's an object of a dog, which is cynophobia, which is very, very, very common as well. We tend to think of phobias as here's an external thing, and people, God love us. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the clip of the lady who was a phobia of olives. I shouldn't be laughing at people, God love us, but that, there's a massive, massive response to an outside object, but to realize that actually some phobias are internal phobias that are a lot more nuanced, a lot more abstract. I've worked with people that have phobias of actually losing weight. That's one that's quite unusual, is that to them it signals lots of very scary things, ill health, disease, death, and it has stopped them historically in their own journeys. Or people that have a phobia of looking silly in the gym, going for a jog. They have a very, very sharp response that feels like a threatening fear, that feels like danger, and is stopping them from living their life to the fullest in ways that they would want to. And I think that's kind of one of the key takeaways for today, is realizing that phobias can be very diverse. They affect various aspects of individuals' lives, from interaction with certain objects, certain scenarios, to behaviors in specific situations or within certain relationships. So if there's a greater understanding of the wide range of phobias, it's an important way to identify them and look at them effectively, because there will be different ways to counteract that fear response. So let's have a quick look at how might one react if they were having a phobia, having a fear response that seems irrationally loud for the situation that they're in. So we have the amygdala, and it's nestled within the brain's median temporal lobe, which doesn't really matter. But basically, the amygdala is a little almond-shaped part of the brain, and it's a pivotal part of in the role of processing fear. It's the epicenter of our emotional responses, including the detection for threats and the activation of that fear response. Remember, the fear response itself is not the enemy because it's there to safeguard us from perceived threats, dangers. It only becomes problematic when it's a little bit off kilter, when it's kind of firing off a little bit too much for us in ways that we could say to ourselves, look, brain, look, body, nothing's going to happen if I pick up the guitar and start strumming in front of somebody. I am not going to drop dead. Thank you for your hard work in trying to keep me safe, but we need to have a little bit of a dialogue around here. So the almond-shaped amygdala is the cluster of nuclei that's crucial for enabling rapid reaction to dangerous situations. So that's our fight or flight response. It's the thing that's going to go, here's a lot more cortisol. It's going to narrow your field of vision. You're going to be very good at fighting. You're going to be much better at running away. And you're going to have a lot more energy in that small amount of time. You'll have a lot more adrenaline rushing through your system. So again, when people talk about panic attacks, for example, or fear response from a phobia, they get the narrowing of the eyesight, which would be a good indication to somebody that their cortisol and adrenaline has gone up. Their heart rate starts to go. They feel like, oh God, I'm half of me is super energized. The other half of me feels like I'm going to faint. That would be a huge, huge response from the fear center. So the neuroscientific research has looked at the amygdala's function in fear conditioning, which is a process in which that neutral stimuli becomes associated with very, very fearful and traumatic events, actually. For those interested, there are studies such as Ledoux, so that's Ledoux. Ledoux's seminal work has shown that the amygdala mediates the learned fear responses, so what we've learned through our environment, and it indicates it's important not just in our innate fears, but also the acquisition of new fears. So the differentiation between normal fear and pathological phobias is the understanding is kind of my word is resting on the understanding of how the amygdala interacts with other brain regions. So I think, as we'd said, a normal fear response is adaptive. It kind of, it'll balance, the prefrontal cortex or CEO of the brain. It'll go, okay, is what I'm experiencing, does it make sense? Is it rational? Am I having the appropriate amount of fear in this scenario? Or is it kind of totally off the charts? Because the amygdala's reaction when we are in a kind of hyperphobic response dysregulates everything altogether. So statistically, phobias, they affect a significant portion of the population. It's about 19 million adults in the US alone. As I said, it's about 12.5% of global population would have suffered at some point, which is a good, actually, the fact that they've the caveat at some point is a good bit of hope to see that because you suffer from a particular phobia now does not mean that you will always have a particular phobia. So what happens in the body is there's a range of very, very intense emotional and physical reactions. Fear, obviously, the natural reaction will be will come up. It can escalate into severe anxiety, panic attacks. Emotionally, the person might feel an overwhelming panic, terror. That's the level that we're thinking of here. Terror or dread at the thought or presence of whatever the source of that phobia is. It can be accompanied by a sense of losing control, an urge to escape, and in some cases, fear of dying. And that might seem really, really extreme, but I promise when like I think of myself on the stage and I know that it's irrational, that my brain will go, we're going to die. And it's so irrational, so irrational, but that's the kind of messaging that come up. Physically, fight or flight will come into the mechanisms of fight or flight will come into action. So we might recognize some of these things as rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, trembling, sweating, dizziness, sweaty palms sweaty, knees weak, mom spaghetti. Some individuals might also experience chest pain. That kind of choking sensation when people have a panic attack, they can often feel that it's mimicking a heart attack. So it's incredibly frightening. It's incredibly real. And, it's not something to be taken lightly. Of course, it's bringing up avoidant behaviors if you can recognize that in yourself. But if it is impacting your quality of life and you are looking to move past it and be gentle with yourself, because all of these things are incredibly frightening, incredibly real. They will trigger, of course, avoidant behaviors, steering clear of situations and objects that will trigger this level of reaction. Of course you would. You'd be almost mad to run headlong into it. That the avoidance itself, and this is the kind of catch-22 with phobias and very, very strong fear, is the avoidance of the phobia actually makes it more entrenched. So the more we avoid it, the stronger the phobia becomes. People with phobias might suffer from anticipatory anxiety, which is basically constantly worrying about encountering the fear, which can really, really impact the mental being and quality of life. Of life. So if you think about the individual that's afraid of dogs, now we might not have these particular phobias in our lives, but it's very likely that somebody you know is very, very frightened of dogs, thunder, motorcycles is another one. These kind of particular phobias. So even though they might not affect us, they might affect somebody that we really care about. And rather than, laughing like I did with the olive lady, God love us. I'm sorry about that. But rather than, making them feel worse about it, rather than misunderstanding and having it be something very other and strange, the more understanding and the more compassion that can be felt for individuals like that, and the mechanisms of what is happening in their brain, happening in their being, it being really, really real for them, is very important. And when there is an individual with something like a fear of motorcycles or a fear of dogs, for example, I'm choosing two examples that are very difficult to control in the wild, in the environment outside of the controlled home environment. That can be extremely nerve-wracking, frightening for individuals that at any corner can feel like, oh God, something might come out and elicit those really, really real symptoms. So the most effective therapeutic method for combating phobias is something known as gradual exposure. So gradual exposure, as the name might suggest, is the opposite of avoidant behaviors. It's also known as exposure therapy, and it's a psychological treatment that's been extensively researched and validated for its effectiveness in treating anxiety disorders, including specific phobias. So it will work for phobias, but it also works for anxiety disorders. The fundamental mechanisms behind exposure therapy is based on the principle of classical conditioning. And if you think of even watching episodes of Frasier when they talk about Freud and conditioning, that's basically what it is. It aims to reduce the fear response by gradually and repeatedly exposing the individual to the feared object or situation, with the caveat of it being without any danger. Right. So in the wild, when somebody encounters a dog, they see the response, but they also have the very real in-person danger of something could happen. Exposure therapy will be different in that it exposes the individual very, very slightly within what's known as their window of tolerance, something that they're able to tolerate. When it goes past that, when it breaks through their window of tolerance, it basically can elicit quite traumatic symptoms and quite, going into that full phobia response. What an individual would be trying to do with exposure therapy is, at the moment, their window of tolerance is tiny to specific fearful situations. Individuals working with exposure therapy would want to basically very, very slowly widen their window of tolerance so that they're more able to deal with a very specific scenario, until it becomes a lot easier to be there in person with that specific fear. So it's priming your system to understand that associating, seeing, thinking of, seeing it on TV, seeing it in a room, whatever they might be, it's safe. It's safe to think about that. Nothing's going to happen in the system. So very, very slowly, the brain learns through neuroplasticity, very slowly through very gentle, compassionate reinforcement of that, working always within the individual's window of tolerance, one can start to associate that particular trigger, whatever it is, with actually the danger going down, 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 down. So the process will help to break that association. It basically removes that big link between the feared stimulus and the anticipated threat, leading to what's known as habituation. So habituation occurs when the person learns through experience that the feared outcome will not materialize. Thereby, it reduces the fear response over time. Another key mechanism there would be extinction, where the conditioned fear response diminishes when the conditioned stimulus, for example, a spider with arachnophobia, is presented without the unconditioned stimulus, example, being bitten. Research will support the efficacy of exposure therapy. For example, meta-analysis published in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology found that exposure-based therapies are very effective for a wide range of anxiety disorders. Specifically, phobias, the success rate of exposure therapy can be as high as 80 or 90%, which is absolutely massive. It's absolutely massive. Tips for if you're doing it at home in a controlled environment would be things like think about a spider and let that be all you do that day, that week even. Pop it into a little journal for yourself and have a goal. Just think about a spider that day. That's all. Baby steps with the brain, baby steps with ourselves, compassionate, very, very gentle with these things. We don't want to break the window of tolerance. If you've had this particular phobia for your entire life, it's okay to take time with undoing it. Don't expect yourself to force through, because you really don't want to be triggering yourself into having anything like a panic attack. Next step could be look at a picture of a spider. Next step could be look at a video of a spider. Next step could be talk about a spider to a friend of yours and let you chat to them and you say, look, I'm doing an exercise. I'm trying to gradually expose myself to it so that I know there's no danger. And it's very, very, very gentle. Now, taking the time to prime yourself for those associations not being scary is actually going to help you. Facing it to the amount that you're capable of facing it at that time period is actually going to help. Avoidant type behaviors will squish it down into the fear and the unconscious even more. Consciously bringing awareness to things will give you a level of choice in how you choose to interact with it. So to finish off some of the other options, the obvious one actually, which I should have mentioned prior, is if you feel, for example, if you've conflict phobia and you feel that it's caged you in quite a bit in your own life, but you don't feel able to particularly manage this by yourself, seek out help from an experienced individual, somebody in a therapeutic field, whatever type of therapy makes sense for you. Lots of people go to cognitive behavioral therapists. They might go to counseling therapists. Or if that's not particularly for you and you like a more holistic approach, whatever type of therapist makes sense for you, that makes you feel calm, safe, and like that level of danger is down. Seek that level of help. You don't have to tackle any of this by yourself ever. Journaling is going to help to reinforce that message that you're safe, a level of mindfulness around it, but with the direct intention that you are tackling this. You're taking tackled steps towards exactly what you are looking to get better. It's not just, mindfulness is going to be helpful anyway across the board, but going in with the intention of you're doing mindfulness around bringing down that stress response, you're able to detach a little bit from the emotion with it. Cognitive behavioral techniques, exposure therapy, and actually support groups, having peer groups. And this doesn't need to be as formal as going in and sitting down during a meeting. It can be something like finding an online group that you're happy to chat through things and have a laugh with other people that have a similar experience to you. Now, I will cut the fear and phobias for today because I'm running over time. I hope you found this helpful. If not for you, then for somebody in your life that may have a fear and phobia that you can see is impacting their quality of life. There are ways around it. Understanding how and why phobias come up in the way that they do will be your first step to being able to tackle them within your window of tolerance. That makes sense for you. Hope you found today helpful. I will chat to you next time and have a lovely rest of your day. Bye now.